What if I told you the remote mountain cabin my family has owned for over 70 years wasn't built entirely by human hands? While restoring the old cedar floorboards, I uncovered my grandfather's hidden 1952 diary, and the brittle pages revealed a terrifying, beautiful secret. He didn't survive that brutal Cascade winter alone. He had a silent, towering partner. Before we open this incredible journal and look at the impossible evidence still etched into the timber today, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're interested in more true stories, evidence analysis, and deep dives into Bigfoot, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The first entries from the summer of 1952 are filled with a sense of grinding, inescapable exhaustion. I found my grandfather Thomas's leather-bound journal hidden beneath the floorboards of our family cabin during a restoration. The pages are stained with sweat and dirt, telling the story of a man pushed to his absolute limits. He had set out to build a sanctuary deep in the high timber of the Cascade Mountains. He wanted a permanent home, miles away from the nearest dirt road and the noise of civilization. Thomas arrived in the remote valley with a pack mule, basic hand tools, and a stubborn dream. He planned to construct a massive, sturdy log cabin entirely by himself, using only the surrounding forest. But the sheer, unforgiving scale of the wilderness quickly began to severely punish his naive optimism. The primary obstacle was the immense, crushing weight of the old-growth cedar trees he had meticulously felled. Each of these massive logs easily weighed upwards of 3 tons, possessing a dense, waterlogged core. Maneuvering these colossal pieces of timber across the uneven, muddy ground was practically a mathematical impossibility. He spent agonizing days simply trying to strip the bark and stage a single log near the footings. The physical reality of the undertaking began to brutally crush his spirit and completely break his body. He was left with bleeding, blistered hands and a constantly aching back that offered absolutely no relief. Thomas wrote bitterly about the terrifying realization that he was just a fragile man, defeated by the mountains. The profound, unbroken isolation of the high timber added a heavy psychological weight to his physical exhaustion. He was completely alone in a vast, silent valley where the wind constantly howled through the upper canopy. Thomas had always considered himself a solitary, self-sufficient man who didn't need anyone else's help to survive. But the sheer emptiness of the Cascades began to slowly erode his sanity during those grueling weeks. He started talking aloud to the towering hemlocks just to hear the sound of a human voice. The grueling labor consumed every waking hour, leaving him too exhausted to even properly cook his meager rations. His grand dream of a peaceful mountain sanctuary was rapidly mutating into a desperate daily struggle to survive. By late August, the daunting reality of his situation had fully set in, casting a dark, heavy shadow. The impending autumn freeze was rapidly approaching, bringing the lethal threat of burying snows and sub-zero temperatures. Without a secure, weatherproof structure, surviving a Cascade winter would be an absolute, freezing impossibility. He hadn't even managed to properly set the foundational base logs deep into the cold mountain mud. He spent his evenings sitting heavily on a freshly cut stump, staring blankly at the scattered, immovable timber. The crushing despair was documented in frantic, messy handwriting, a stark contrast to his usual neat script. He was seriously contemplating abandoning the entire project, packing up his mule, and retreating in humiliating defeat. It was during one of these bleak, emotionally exhausted evenings that everything in his world fundamentally changed. He was sitting exceptionally close to his small campfire, trying to massage the cramps out of his arms. The night air was perfectly still, lacking even the slightest breeze to rustle the dense canopy above. Suddenly, the ambient, familiar sounds of the nocturnal forest completely and abruptly ceased around his small camp. The woods went terrifyingly, unnaturally silent, as if the entire mountain had collectively held its breath. Thomas reached instinctively for his heavy hunting rifle, his survival instincts screaming that a massive predator had arrived. But the profound shift in the atmosphere didn't feel like a prowling grizzly bear or a starving mountain lion. The air temperature violently plummeted, and a strange, heavy, musky scent suddenly flooded the small clearing. The flickering orange light of his campfire seemed to struggle against an invisible, heavy pressure in the dark. Thomas slowly stood up, gripping his rifle tightly, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his bruised ribs. He scanned the dense, impenetrable wall of darkness, feeling a heavy, static charge making his hair stand up. He peered intently into the shadows, just beyond the fragile, flickering reach of his dying firelight. That was when he finally noticed a massive, shadowed presence, standing completely motionless at the dense tree line. It was incredibly tall, easily towering over 8 feet, possessing a physical bulk that defied standard biology. The silhouette was broad-shouldered and immensely powerful, covered in thick, matted hair that absorbed the ambient light. Thomas froze completely, the heavy rifle suddenly feeling entirely useless against the magnificent, terrifying anomaly before him. The creature didn't make a single aggressive move toward the fire, nor did it attempt to conceal itself. It simply stood there, an impossibly dark void against the timber, watching my grandfather with an intense focus. Thomas noted in his journal that the being's posture wasn't that of a mindless, feral beast-hunting prey. It felt like he was being deeply analyzed, evaluated by an intellect that felt older than the trees themselves. The sheer cognitive pressure radiating from the entity made his own mind feel incredibly small and entirely exposed. He didn't dare raise his rifle, instinctively understanding that any act of aggression would be a fatal mistake. He simply lowered the weapon slowly to the dirt, offering a silent gesture of absolute submission to the giant. The entity remained entirely motionless for several long minutes, its gaze locked directly onto the exhausted human. It was a profound cross-species encounter, bridging an impossible evolutionary gap, happening in absolute, tense silence. Without making a single sound or snapping a fragile twig, the massive silhouette seamlessly faded back into the dark. The ambient sounds of the nocturnal forest abruptly returned, leaving Thomas trembling violently by the dying fire. He collapsed heavily back onto his wooden stump, frantically documenting every impossible detail in his leather journal. He finally fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, convinced his mind had simply snapped from the crushing isolation. When the sun broke over the high ridges the next morning, he crawled stiffly out of his canvas lean-to. He fully expected to find the massive 3-ton cedar logs sitting exactly where he had frustratingly abandoned them. When the freezing mountain sun finally broke over the high ridges the next morning, Thomas crawled stiffly out of his canvas lean-to. He rubbed his tired eyes, grabbing his tin coffee cup to fight off the biting autumn frost of 52. He fully expected to find the massive 3-ton cedar logs sitting exactly where he had frustratingly abandoned them. He walked slowly toward the muddy foundation trench, his mind still heavily clouded by the impossible encounter from the night before. But as he looked at the staging area, his tin cup slipped from his trembling hands and clattered to the dirt. The physical reality of the entire construction site had been completely and effortlessly altered while he slept. The 3 massive center-post logs were no longer lying horizontally in the freezing, churned-up mud of the clearing. These were the exact timbers he had spent 3 agonizing days, failing to move even a single inch. Now, they were standing perfectly upright, defying gravity with an imposing, majestic silence. They were flawlessly dropped into their deep, hand-dug foundation footings, perfectly aligned with his string guides. He approached the massive cedar pillars with a profound, terrifying sense of absolute disbelief. He touched the rough bark, half expecting the solid wood to be a lingering, exhaustion-induced hallucination. But the wood was incredibly solid, deeply and firmly rooted in the frozen earth of the Cascades. He frantically looked around the perimeter of the clearing for any obvious signs of heavy machinery or block-and-tackle rigging. Architectural blueprints from that era show this specific task required at least 10 strong men working in absolute unison. Alternatively, it required a gas-powered winch that absolutely didn't exist anywhere near that rugged, inaccessible terrain. There were absolutely no drag lines from heavy ropes or steel cables wrapping the bark of the standing trees. The surrounding brush hadn't been crushed by a massive team of loggers aggressively hiking into the secluded valley. There were absolutely no tire tracks carved into the soft, muddy clearing to explain the miraculous, heavy lifting. The only disruption to the pristine morning mud was located right next to the base of the massive pillars. Thomas knelt down, his heart hammering against his bruised ribs all over again as he studied the ground. He stared at a single massive impression pressed deeply and deliberately into the damp earth. The footprint measured easily twice the length of his own heavy leather work boot. It was incredibly wide, showing the distinct, deep impressions of 5 massive, splayed toes gripping the mud. The sheer weight required to sink that deeply into the packed dirt was mathematically staggering. He realized immediately that this impossible track wasn't left by a wandering, heavy grizzly bear. This was the undeniable physical signature of the towering, shadowed presence from the night before. The silent, terrifying observer had miraculously stepped out of the dark to become an active, incredibly powerful laborer. On October 12th, Thomas sat down on his stump and frantically updated his leather-bound journal. He documented the impossible physics of the perfectly upright logs and the massive track left behind. He wrote about the terrifying, awe-inspiring realization that he was sharing his isolated valley with a giant. This was a giant that possessed the sheer, brute strength of a modern, heavy diesel machine. Yet, this incredible creature operated with a ghostly, completely silent precision in the absolute dead of night. His initial primal fear was slowly being replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of deep reverence. For the next week, Thomas continued his grueling daytime routine with a completely renewed nervous energy. He would fell the timber, strip the heavy bark, and carefully measure the complex notches required for the walls. He intentionally left the impossible task of hoisting the heavy beams entirely for the deep night. As the sun dipped below the jagged ridges, he would retreat into his fragile canvas lean-to. He would sit in the pitch black, his rifle resting uselessly beside him, listening intently to the freezing darkness. He waited patiently for the heavy, rhythmic thuds of massive timber being effortlessly manipulated outside his tent. The Bigfoot never showed itself during the bright, revealing hours of the mountain daylight. The massive creature strictly operated under the protective, dense cover of the high-altitude dusk. Every single morning, Thomas would step out of his tent to find the impossible work completed perfectly. Massive, 300-pound crossbeams were magically slotted into their precise, elevated notches without a single scratch. The cabin was rapidly taking shape at a speed that completely defied all human physical capability. He was witnessing an architectural miracle orchestrated by an unseen, incredibly powerful nocturnal force. The sheer, calculated intelligence behind the creature's heavy labor was absolutely undeniable to my grandfather. This wasn't a mindless beast, randomly stacking wood like a chaotic feral animal building a den. The Sasquatch was perfectly interpreting my grandfather's complex architectural layout, laid out in the dirt and string. It understood the structural necessity of the load-bearing walls and the intricate overlapping joinery of the corners. It was actively reading the physical blueprint of the cabin and flawlessly executing the heavy lifting required. Thomas realized he wasn't just being randomly helped, he was actively collaborating with an ancient, brilliant mind. The crushing, depressive isolation that had previously plagued Thomas completely evaporated into the cold mountain air. He no longer felt like a fragile, broken man fighting a desperately losing war against the mountain. He felt a strange, profound kinship with the massive, unseen entity sharing his heavy physical burden. He began to leave his hand tools neatly organized, almost out of a deep, unspoken respect for his partner. He wanted to make the nocturnal labor as seamless as possible for the giant doing the heavy lifting. The cabin was no longer just a solitary human sanctuary. It was rapidly becoming a joint, interspecies monument. But my grandfather knew he had to establish some form of basic, mutual acknowledgement with the creature. He couldn't just silently accept the monumental, back-breaking labor without offering something valuable in return. He considered leaving out his shiny tools or extra blankets, but quickly dismissed them as completely useless. He needed a universal currency that translated perfectly across the vast, terrifying evolutionary divide between them. He looked at his dwindling supply of smoked venison, hanging securely from the heavy meat pole. It was a high-value protein, absolutely critical for his own survival through the impending, brutal Cascade winter. But Thomas also knew the giant was burning a massive amount of calories to lift those massive cedar logs. He decided to take a calculated, dangerous risk to bridge the gap between their two completely different species. He sliced a generous, thick portion of the heavily smoked meat with his sharp hunting knife. As the twilight shadows dramatically lengthened across the clearing, he walked to a large, flat stump near the tree line. He placed the savory offering carefully on the wood, stepped back, and turned toward his canvas lean-to. He didn't look back, wanting to give the massive creature the absolute space and respect it commanded. He sat on his cot in the dark, listening closely to the silence of the impending night. He was about to discover exactly how this impossible, silent partnership would finally learn to communicate. The brutal Cascade winter finally arrived, covering the muddy construction site in a thick blanket of pristine snow. Despite the freezing temperatures, the symbiotic work routine between my grandfather and the giant had become incredibly efficient. Thomas would spend his short daylight hours meticulously prepping the heavy timber with his sharp hand tools. He carved the intricate saddle notches required to interlock the massive cedar logs with absolute precision. He knew he didn't have to worry about the back-breaking, impossible task of actually hoisting them into place. As the sun dipped below the frozen ridges, he retreated to his canvas tent to let his partner work. The dense, high-altitude dusk served as a silent, heavily respected boundary line, separating their two distinct shifts. Thomas would sit by his small, crackling iron stove, his exhausted muscles finally finding a brief moment of relief. Outside in the bitter cold, the massive, shadowed presence would emerge seamlessly from the dense, snow-covered tree line. The ground would faintly vibrate beneath my grandfather's cot as the giant effortlessly maneuvered the 3-ton logs. He listened with absolute awe as the heavy timber was hoisted high into the freezing mountain air. The cabin's walls steadily rose higher every single night, completely defying the physical limits of a solitary man. They absolutely never spoke a single human word to each other during the entire grueling construction process. The vast evolutionary divide between them was far too wide for something as clumsy as spoken language. Instead, they developed a brilliant, highly effective system of percussive communication using the very timber they were stacking. Thomas would strike a hollow log with his heavy steel hammer to signal that a notched beam was ready. The sharp, echoing crack would travel deep into the frozen woods, effectively ringing the bell for the night shift. It was a primitive, beautiful language born out of absolute necessity and deep, mutual respect for the work. The giant quickly adapted to this percussive system, responding with heavy, resonant knocks that shook the frozen branches. When the Sasquatch was ready to hoist a particularly massive log, it would deliver a single, deafening blow. That single, heavy knock was a clear, undeniable signal that meant lift in their unspoken, shared vocabulary. Once the timber was perfectly slotted into the saddle notch, 2 rapid, powerful knocks would immediately follow. Those 2 strikes effectively meant set, confirming that the heavy wall was completely secure and perfectly aligned. Thomas would smile in the dark of his tent, completely amazed by the creature's sharp, structural intelligence. The acoustic power behind the creature's percussive knocks was absolutely terrifying in its sheer, raw intensity. The sound easily cut through the howling winter wind, echoing off the jagged limestone walls of the valley. Yet the giant possessed an incredible, calculated restraint, never striking the wood hard enough to splinter the notches. It operated with the careful, measured precision of a master carpenter, despite possessing the brute strength of a machine. My grandfather would run his hands over the joints the next morning, marveling at the flawless, tight fit. The impossible structure was structurally sound, held together by gravity, friction, and an unbelievable interspecies alliance. To honor this incredible partnership, Thomas strictly maintained the nightly ritual he had initiated on that flat stump. Every single evening, just before retreating to his tent, he placed a thick slab of smoked venison on the wood. He considered it a deeply necessary wage for the monumental back-breaking labor the giant was willingly providing. The high-value protein was a crucial offering, representing a massive sacrifice from his own dwindling winter survival rations. He knew the massive creature needed thousands of calories just to survive the freezing temperatures, let alone build a house. The flat stump officially became a neutral, heavily respected trading post, bridging the gap between their 2 worlds. The massive creature never immediately rushed the stump like a starving, mindless beast, driven purely by feral instinct. It possessed an incredible, disciplined patience, always waiting in the dense shadows until Thomas was safely inside his tent. Only when the canvas flap was securely tied shut would the heavy, muffled footsteps approach the clearing. Thomas would sit completely still in the dark, listening to the massive lungs inhaling the freezing, smoky air. He could hear the creature softly grunting, a low, rumbling vibration that resonated directly in his own chest. The offering was never aggressively snatched. It was carefully and deliberately collected from the snow-covered wood. Thomas documented these nightly exchanges with a profound, almost religious sense of awe in his leather-bound journal. He was completely mesmerized by the quiet, dignified intelligence the towering creature constantly displayed in the dark. He wrote, "He doesn't eat like a beast. He waits until I'm inside, then takes the meat." My grandfather noted that the transaction felt less like feeding an animal and more like paying a respected colleague. He continued, "He takes the meat with a nod toward the window that I feel in my very bones." It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement that completely shattered any remaining illusions of the creature being a primitive monster. This daily, rhythmic alliance completely saved my grandfather from the crushing, depressive isolation of the high timber. He was no longer a solitary, broken man, slowly losing his sanity to the deafening silence of the Cascades. He was actively collaborating with an ancient, majestic neighbor who perfectly understood the brutal demands of the environment. The fear that had initially paralyzed him was entirely replaced by a deep, enduring sense of profound gratitude. He looked forward to the freezing nights, finding a strange, comforting peace in the heavy footsteps outside his wall. The valley was no longer an empty, hostile void. It was a shared territory, actively guarded by a giant. By late January, the massive exterior walls of the log cabin had finally reached their towering absolute peak. The structure was an imposing fortress-like sanctuary, completely built to withstand the harshest blizzards the mountain could throw. The heavy, interlocking corners were a flawless testament to the incredible, unspoken teamwork between a man and a myth. Thomas spent his days meticulously chinking the massive gaps between the cedar logs with thick, freezing mud and moss. He was completely sealing out the bitter wind, finally securing the warm, weatherproof interior he had desperately dreamed of. The impossible task was nearly complete, entirely thanks to the massive, shadowed hands that worked in the dark. The final, most dangerous phase of the construction required lifting the massive, incredibly heavy ridgepole into place. This single, towering piece of timber would completely define the architectural pitch and absolute strength of the entire roof. Thomas spent 3 grueling days shaping the heavy log, knowing it was far too massive for even the giant. He set up a complex series of thick rope pulleys, hoping to assist his partner with the staggering weight. He left the largest, thickest cut of smoked venison on the stump that evening, a silent plea for an extraordinary effort. He retreated to his tent, completely terrified that the massive beam would finally break the limits of their alliance. The freezing wind violently howled through the valley that night, violently thrashing the dense canopy of ancient hemlocks. Thomas waited nervously in the dark, listening for the familiar, reassuring, percussive knock that meant the giant was ready. He heard the heavy crunch of snow, but it was accompanied by a completely different, much more aggressive sound. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the opposite side of the clearing, completely unrelated to the majestic Sasquatch. Something incredibly massive and incredibly hungry had violently picked up the scent of the smoked venison, sitting on the stump. The peaceful, rhythmic alliance was abruptly shattered, forcing the unseen laborer to aggressively step into a completely new role. The freezing wind violently howled through the valley, masking the heavy crunch of snow outside the canvas tent. Thomas waited nervously in the dark, his hand instinctively reaching for the cold steel of his hunting rifle. The deep, guttural growl echoing from the opposite side of the clearing was unmistakably that of a grizzly. The massive, starving bear had caught the irresistible scent of the thick, smoked venison resting on the stump. It completely bypassed the intended trading post, its primal hunger driving it directly toward the fragile canvas lean-to. My grandfather could hear the massive claws tearing at the frozen earth just a few feet from his cot. The thin fabric of the tent offered absolutely no protection against 1,000 pounds of desperate apex muscle. Thomas scrambled backward in the pitch black, frantically trying to chamber a round into his heavy hunting rifle. His frozen, trembling fingers fumbled with the cold metal mechanism, costing him precious, potentially life-saving seconds in the dark. The grizzly let out a deafening roar, rearing up on its hind legs to violently crush the fragile shelter. Thomas braced himself for the inevitable, crushing impact of the massive beast crashing through the thin canvas walls. He closed his eyes tightly, knowing his weapon was completely useless against the sheer momentum of a starving bear. But the devastating, crushing blow from the massive grizzly bear miraculously never struck my terrified grandfather's fragile tent. Before the beast could bring its heavy weight down on the canvas, a completely different sound violently erupted. A deafening, earth-shattering roar exploded from the dense tree line, completely dwarfing the aggressive vocalizations of the angry grizzly. It was a sound so incredibly powerful and deep that it caused the cold coffee in Thomas's mug to ripple. The sheer acoustic force of the challenge physically shook the frozen ground beneath the floorboards of the lean-to. The terrifying noise was immediately followed by the sound of snapping timber as something massive charged into the clearing. Thomas cautiously unlaced the flap of his tent, peering out into the freezing, moonlit expanse of the snowy clearing. The massive grizzly had immediately dropped to all fours, its aggressive posture completely replaced by sheer, primal panic. Standing between the terrified bear and my grandfather's fragile tent was the towering, shadowed silhouette of the silent laborer. The Bigfoot had violently stepped out of the protective darkness, fully exposing itself in the pale, silver moonlight. It stood incredibly tall, its broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, aggressive breaths that plumed in the freezing air. The giant wasn't holding a weapon. Its sheer, overwhelming physical mass was the ultimate, undeniable threat to the bear. The grizzly bear, typically the undisputed apex predator of the Cascade Mountains, began to slowly and nervously back away. It completely abandoned the enticing scent of the smoked venison, utterly terrified by the towering anomaly aggressively blocking its path. The Sasquatch took a single heavy step forward, letting out another deep, guttural warning that vibrated through the snow. It was a clear, undeniable territorial claim, violently asserting dominance over the entire clearing and everything within its borders. The grizzly didn't dare challenge the magnificent giant, quickly turning and fleeing frantically back into the dense, dark timber. Thomas watched in absolute awe as the greatest threat to his survival was effortlessly chased away without a single physical strike. The clearing fell completely silent once again, save for the howling winter wind violently whipping through the upper canopy. The towering giant didn't turn to acknowledge my grandfather, peering through the small unlaced gap in the canvas tent. It simply stood guard in the freezing snow for several long minutes, ensuring the massive bear had completely vacated the valley. The creature was no longer just a silent nocturnal laborer, efficiently hoisting heavy cedar logs into the freezing air. It had aggressively transformed into a fierce, dedicated protector, actively defending the fragile human who shared its isolated territory. Thomas slowly lowered his hunting rifle, completely overwhelmed by the profound realization of what had just miraculously transpired. He retreated back to his cot, pulling his heavy wool blankets tightly around his shivering, adrenaline-fueled frame. He grabbed his leather journal and a pencil, his hands shaking so violently he could barely form the letters. He frantically documented the terrifying grizzly encounter and the incredible, majestic intervention of his towering, shadowed partner. The absolute fear of the unknown that had completely consumed him during his first weeks was permanently, instantly erased. He wrote, "For the first time in my life, I felt truly safe in the completely wild, unforgiving timber." The giant had successfully established a protective perimeter around the camp, granting my grandfather a profound, unprecedented sense of security. Thomas spent the rest of the freezing night contemplating the incredible evolutionary implications of the giant's protective actions. A feral, mindless beast would have simply waited for the grizzly to eliminate the human before claiming the venison. But the Sasquatch had actively chosen to fiercely defend a completely different, significantly weaker species from a lethal threat. It demonstrated a profound, empathic intelligence and a deep, unspoken loyalty that completely defied standard, primitive biological behavior. He realized the creature actively valued their rhythmic, percussive alliance far more than a simple, easy meal in the snow. The massive being recognized Thomas as a legitimate contributing partner in the shared, exhausting labor of the log cabin. The very next morning, Thomas walked out into the clearing to survey the heavy tracks left in the snow. The massive, chaotic impressions of the fleeing grizzly were completely overshadowed by the deliberate, deep footprints of the giant. He traced the path the Sasquatch had aggressively taken to successfully intercept the charging bear just feet from the tent. The sheer physical power required to instantly halt a charging grizzly with pure intimidation was absolutely staggering to comprehend. He looked at the massive, unfinished log walls of his cabin, a profound sense of gratitude washing over him. The structure was no longer just a physical shelter. It was a permanent wooden monument to an impossible friendship. Thomas noted in his journal that the frightening monster of the local legends wasn't pacing outside his walls. The magnificent, towering creature was actually the sole reason those incredibly heavy walls were standing upright in the first place. He completely stopped carrying his heavy hunting rifle around the perimeter of the clearing during his daylight working hours. He trusted the invisible, empathic perimeter established by the giant far more than the cold steel of his weapon. The valley belonged entirely to the Sasquatch, and Thomas was simply a grateful, heavily protected guest in its domain. The remaining weeks of the brutal winter construction proceeded with a completely renewed, incredible sense of shared purpose. The heavy ridgepole that Thomas had desperately worried about was effortlessly hoisted into place the very next evening. He heard the familiar percussive double knock echoing through the freezing air, confirming the massive beam was perfectly set. The final towering structural component of the log cabin was officially locked in, completing the impossible, back-breaking architectural puzzle. My grandfather could finally begin moving his meager belongings out of the fragile tent and into the sturdy timber fortress. He spent his first night inside the cabin sitting by the newly built stone hearth, listening to the wind. The howling blizzard violently battered the exterior walls, but the thick interlocking cedar logs held perfectly firm and warm. The grueling physical labor of erecting the heavy timber shell was officially incredibly complete after months of freezing struggle. However, the unique interspecies relationship between my grandfather and the protective giant was far from being completely over. The massive creature continued to silently patrol the dark perimeter of the clearing, leaving subtle signs of its presence. Thomas began to notice incredibly precise, deliberate markings etched directly into the rough bark of the cabin's exterior walls. He also started finding strange, beautiful objects carefully placed near the flat stump where the venison used to sit. These incredibly unique artifacts required a much closer, deeply focused physical inspection the following morning in the bright daylight. The physical proof of this incredible, impossible alliance is still clearly visible on the cabin walls today. When I inherited the property and began the tedious 2026 restoration process, I started noticing the anomaly. I was carefully stripping decades of accumulated grime and weather damage from the heavy exterior cedar logs. My grandfather's intricate saddle notches were perfectly preserved, but there were other much larger marks present. These strange indentations were completely inconsistent with the sharp, clean strikes of his heavy steel axes. They were wide, blunt compressions, pressed directly into the dense grain of the ancient timber itself. I brought out a tall ladder and my measuring tape to properly document the highest points of the structure. I focused specifically on the massive, load-bearing gables that securely held the heavy roof pitch together. The deepest, most pronounced compression marks were located nearly 11 feet completely off the soft ground. There was absolutely no physical way my grandfather could have reached that staggering height while working alone. No man standing on a precarious wooden ladder in 1953 could have achieved that level of precision. He certainly couldn't do it while simultaneously holding and maneuvering a 300-pound cedar beam in the dark. These markings were the undeniable fossilized fingerprints of the silent laborer who had built this sanctuary. They perfectly outlined the sheer brute force required to violently compress raw wood with bare hands. The giant hadn't used tools to adjust the stubborn, freezing logs during the brutal winter nights. It had simply gripped the massive timber and forced it into the notches through sheer, overwhelming strength. I ran my own fragile human fingers over the wide indentations, feeling a profound connection to the past. The wood still held the physical memory of the incredible creature that had guarded my grandfather's life. But the blunt compressions on the high timber were not the only secrets the old cabin held. As I meticulously replaced the crumbling dried mud chinking between the lower logs, I found something extraordinary. I was carefully scraping away the 70-year-old dirt when my trowel struck something incredibly hard and smooth. It wasn't a standard, jagged rock that had simply been mixed into the mud for structural stability. I pulled a perfectly polished, beautifully round river stone from the deep crevice between the cedar beams. It was completely out of place, possessing a smooth texture that only years of rushing water could create. The nearest fast-flowing river capable of polishing a stone to that degree was miles down the treacherous mountain. My exhausted grandfather certainly wouldn't have wasted precious daylight hiking down the ridge just to collect decorative rocks. Over the next few days of restoration, I uncovered a dozen more of these beautiful, smooth stones. They were intentionally and carefully tucked deep into the exterior chinking, specifically clustered around the heavy front door. These weren't random geological anomalies trapped in the mud. They were deliberate, thoughtful placements made by massive hands. They were quiet, respectful tokens left behind by a giant who clearly appreciated the newly constructed sanctuary. The most profound artifact I discovered was hidden completely out of sight, tucked beneath the porch floorboards. I was replacing a rotting plank when I noticed a strange, heavy object wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas. I carefully unwrapped the decaying fabric, my breath catching as I fully realized what my grandfather had hidden. It was a massive, incredibly heavy piece of beautifully crystallized petrified wood, sparkling faintly in the mountain sunlight. Thomas had kept this specific object entirely separate from his tools, treating it with a deeply reverent care. This wasn't just another interesting rock he had stumbled upon while fiercely battling the brutal wilderness. The petrified wood was an ancient, geological treasure that carried immense unspoken value in the deep forest. To a creature intimately connected to the earth, gifting a fossilized piece of timber was a massive gesture. It was a profound symbol of enduring strength, perfectly mirroring the heavy wooden fortress they had built together. The Sasquatch hadn't just seen my grandfather as a fragile, pathetic human needing desperate physical charity. The giant had ultimately viewed Thomas as a legitimate, highly respected peer in the unforgiving high timber. This beautifully crystallized wood was the ultimate wage, a physical manifestation of their incredible rhythmic alliance. I carefully placed the polished river stones and the piece of petrified wood on the heavy wooden table inside. Sitting in the very room my grandfather had painstakingly designed, the historical weight of the artifacts was overwhelming. The cabin was a living museum, completely dedicated to an interspecies friendship that the modern world would instantly reject. I spent hours reading through Thomas's journals again, trying to match the dates of the entries to my physical discoveries. He rarely mentioned the stones, keeping the profound details of the gifts entirely to himself during his lifetime. He aggressively protected the true, beautiful nature of his silent partner from the prying eyes of the outside world. The absolute physical proof of the Bigfoot's labor completely surrounded me, permanently etched into the very walls. The 11-foot grip marks and the heavy structural precision of the roof pitch were undeniable architectural facts. Yet, the scientific community would desperately try to aggressively debunk the cabin's construction with flawed, arrogant logic. They would invent ridiculous, elaborate theories involving hidden winches and undocumented teams of loggers to explain the timber. They simply could not accept the terrifying, beautiful reality that a giant had laid the foundation of this home. The truth was violently incompatible with their sanitized, rigid understanding of human history and evolutionary biology. My grandfather fully understood this devastating reality, which is exactly why he hid the journals and the petrified wood. He knew that exposing the cabin's true origins would instantly invite a chaotic, destructive circus into his peaceful valley. The government and the ambitious academics would completely overrun the high timber, violently searching for the silent laborer. They would actively attempt to cage the magnificent spirit that had freely given him a safe, warm home. Thomas chose absolute, enduring silence over the hollow, fleeting fame that revealing the truth would inevitably bring. He completely sacrificed his own incredible story to ensure the towering guardian remained permanently safe in the dark. I ran my hand across the rough, aged cedar of the interior wall, deeply respecting his difficult, solitary decision. The massive logs had successfully weathered 70 years of brutal blizzards, perfectly retaining the heat of the stone hearth. The sanctuary was still standing strong, an imposing fortress completely built on a foundation of absolute trust. The giant's physical labor had effortlessly bridged the massive, terrifying gap between our two completely different worlds. The beautifully polished river stones were the undeniable evidence of a deep, emotional intelligence that humanity completely lacked. The cabin was a permanent wooden testament to the impossible, demonstrating what could be achieved through silent respect. As I continued reading through the final pages of the 1954 entries, the tone of the journal began to shift. The grueling physical labor was completely finished, and my grandfather was finally settling into his quiet mountain life. The nightly, percussive knocks had slowly faded away, signaling the end of the heavy, rhythmic winter construction phase. The massive, shadowed presence was no longer required to actively patrol the perimeter or hoist the heavy timber. Thomas had spent his last few quiet evenings documenting the completed structure before putting his heavy pen down. He decided to capture the sheer, majestic beauty of his impossible sanctuary using a completely different visual medium. I carefully turned the brittle, yellowed parchment to the very last page of the 1954 entries. The heavy ink script that had meticulously documented the grueling construction process abruptly came to an end. Instead of frantic, exhausted handwriting, my grandfather had used a thick piece of charred wood to draw. It was a remarkably detailed, beautifully shaded charcoal sketch taking up the entire span of the paper. Thomas had never mentioned possessing any artistic talent in his earlier, desperately bleak accounts of the valley, yet the rendering was incredibly precise, capturing the raw, imposing majesty of his newly finished mountain sanctuary. The sketch perfectly depicted the completed log cabin sitting proudly in the center of the snowy clearing. Thick, stylized plumes of dark smoke were drawn billowing out of the sturdy stone chimney into the night. A warm, inviting glow radiated from the small glass windows, representing the cabin's very first hearth fire. Thomas had used aggressive, heavy strokes to emphasize the impenetrable darkness of the surrounding ancient hemlock forest. The contrast between the fragile, illuminated human shelter and the vast, freezing wilderness was captured absolutely perfectly. The cabin looked like a tiny, glowing fortress, successfully holding back the chaotic, unforgiving forces of nature. But the most striking element of the charcoal drawing wasn't the sturdy cabin or the glowing fire. Standing just beyond the fragile reach of the window's light was a towering, heavily shaded, massive silhouette. It was the undeniable, magnificent form of the silent laborer who had made the sanctuary a physical reality. Thomas had drawn the giant with incredibly broad shoulders and long, powerful arms resting quietly by its sides. The creature was looking directly at the glowing cabin, adopting the posture of a proud, quiet guardian. It was a beautiful visual testament to the incredible being that ruled the high timber of the Cascades. The artwork successfully conveyed a profound, emotional depth that mere words in a diary could never achieve. The giant in the sketch didn't look like a terrifying feral monster preparing to violently attack the home. It possessed a calm, dignified stillness, a majestic sentry watching over the fragile human it had actively chosen to protect. Thomas had even added a faint, subtle reflection in the creature's eyes, perfectly mirroring the hearth fire. This tiny, brilliant detail completely humanized the massive silhouette, bridging the evolutionary gap with a simple smudge. The sketch was the ultimate heartfelt thank you note to a partner who could never actually read it. This single drawing perfectly encapsulated the profound transformation my grandfather had undergone during those 2 brutal years. He had arrived in the valley as an arrogant, solitary man, aggressively determined to conquer the mountain. He ended the construction phase as a deeply humbled, grateful tenant, sharing a massive, ancient, wild territory. The charcoal rendering was the absolute culmination of their silent, percussive alliance forged in the bitter cold. The heavy lifting was officially over, the massive cedar logs were permanently set, and the partnership was fulfilled. The giant had effortlessly provided the raw physical strength, and Thomas was honoring the achievement in charcoal. Directly beneath the heavy, dark shading of the towering silhouette, Thomas had scribbled a final, brief note. The handwriting was no longer frantic or exhausted. It was incredibly deliberate, steady, and filled with peaceful resolution. The first sentence of the final entry read, "He has gone back to the high ridges now that the roof is on." It was a simple, profound acknowledgement of the natural, inevitable conclusion to their shared, backbreaking winter labor. The Sasquatch hadn't abandoned him. It had simply retreated to its own deeply secluded, inaccessible mountain sanctuary. The monumental job was successfully finished, completely eliminating the creature's need to visit the freezing, muddy clearing. That specific opening sentence carried a heavy, lingering sense of melancholy mixed with profound, enduring respect. Thomas completely understood that the giant was a creature of the high, unforgiving timber, not a domesticated pet. The valley floor was my grandfather's newly claimed domain, but the jagged, freezing peaks belonged exclusively to the Bigfoot. The creature had temporarily descended from its hidden fortress solely to assist a struggling, pathetic human being. With the heavy ridgepole perfectly in place, the majestic laborer was free to return to the deep shadows. The unspoken, rhythmic contract between the 2 vastly different species had been successfully and completely honored. The next line, written in the journal, permanently solidified the profound, unbreakable pact between the 2 survivors. Thomas wrote clearly in the dark ink, "He gave me a home and in return I gave him my silence." This was the ultimate, highest form of gratitude my grandfather could possibly offer to the massive, protective entity. He knew that the giant's continued peaceful survival depended entirely on remaining a ridiculous, easily dismissed local myth. By aggressively locking his lips, Thomas became the unseen, silent warden of the greatest biological secret on Earth. The heavy protective walls of the cabin were officially built on a foundational promise of absolute enduring secrecy. The sheer, suffocating weight of that specific promise defined the entire rest of my grandfather's long life. He honored that sacred, unspoken agreement with an ironclad resolve, never breathing a single word to his family. When townspeople marveled at the impossible massive logs of his cabin, Thomas would simply smile and shrug. He allowed them to blindly believe he possessed an incredible, superhuman work ethic and a complex block-and-tackle system. He actively swallowed his own pride, completely surrendering the architectural credit to aggressively protect his silent partner. His silence was a heavy, invisible shield, permanently deployed to keep the modern, destructive world completely away. The final sentence on that aged, brittle page perfectly summarized his deep, terrifying fear of human nature. Thomas boldly declared, "I will take this truth to my grave, for the world would only try to cage the spirit that helped me survive." He intimately understood the dark, ambitious greed that constantly drives the scientific community and the trophy hunters. Exposing the gentle, highly intelligent giant would instantly trigger a massive, violent invasion of the pristine Cascades. Men with heavy rifles and steel transport cages would aggressively flood the valley, desperately seeking biological fame. My grandfather point-blank refused to be the fragile catalyst that ultimately destroyed the ancient, majestic mountain lineage. Looking at the charcoal sketch, I felt the heavy, crushing truth of his final words echoing in the room. The world we live in is incredibly cruel, completely incapable of peacefully coexisting with something vastly superior. We aggressively dissect, categorize, and permanently imprison anything that fundamentally challenges our fragile, arrogant dominance over nature. Thomas had looked into the bioluminescent eyes of the giant and recognized a soul that demanded absolute freedom. He took his magnificent, world-shattering secret to his grave, exactly as he promised in the dark ink. He successfully protected his friend, leaving behind only this hidden journal and the impossible, towering cedar walls. I gently closed the heavy leather cover of the 1954 diary, completely overwhelmed by the emotional historical record. The warm, inviting cabin I was currently sitting inside was a silent, permanent monument to an incredible myth. My grandfather had successfully fulfilled his end of the bargain, maintaining the absolute illusion of a solitary builder. But as I looked out the very same window depicted in the sketch, a completely new thought emerged. The giant had retreated to the high ridges 70 years ago, but an intelligence that deep never truly forgets its friends. I realized I urgently needed to walk the perimeter of the ancient property to see what the shadows were currently hiding. During my extensive 2026 restoration of the cabin, I felt an overwhelming urge to explore the surrounding timber. The revelations hidden within my grandfather's dusty, leather-bound journal had fundamentally shifted my entire perspective of the valley. I was no longer just replacing rotting floorboards and resealing the thick mud chinking of an old building. I was actively walking the exact same historic grounds where an incredible interspecies alliance had once miraculously thrived. I strapped on my heavy hiking boots and stepped off the safety of the sturdy wooden porch. I needed to investigate the dense, shadowed perimeter of the property to see what the ancient forest held. The morning air was crisp and biting as I pushed through the thick, overgrown underbrush bordering the clearing. I was actively searching for any remaining physical evidence that Thomas's silent partner hadn't just been a fleeting anomaly. 70 years had passed since the massive ridgepole was hoisted into the freezing mountain air by unseen hands. A standard biological lifespan would suggest that the specific giant from the 1952 encounters was likely long dead. However, a profound, highly intelligent species capable of building a fortress wouldn't simply vanish without leaving a trace. I suspected that the deep, unmapped valleys of the Cascades still harbored the descendants of that magnificent guardian. As I hiked deeper into the old-growth cedar, the ambient sounds of the modern world completely faded away. The oppressive, towering silence of the high timber that had initially terrified my grandfather quickly swallowed me whole. But armed with the knowledge from his diary, I didn't feel the paralyzing, primal fear of an intruder. I felt a strange, comforting sense of being quietly observed by eyes perfectly hidden in the dense canopy. The forest felt incredibly alive, vibrating with a subtle, localized energy that defied simple ecological explanation. I was actively walking through a heavily monitored sovereign territory that officially belonged to a completely hidden lineage. About a mile from the cabin, I stumbled upon a section of the forest that felt distinctly altered. The chaotic, random growth patterns of the wild timber suddenly gave way to a highly organized, deliberate arrangement. I stopped dead in my tracks, completely mesmerized by the massive ancient trees surrounding a small mossy clearing. This wasn't a natural clearing created by a fallen cedar or a random, destructive lightning strike in the dark. The vegetation had been meticulously, actively managed to create a perfect circular opening in the dense mountain brush. I stepped cautiously into the center of the clearing, recognizing the undeniable fingerprints of an incredibly heavy intelligence. Surrounding the perimeter of this hidden clearing was a breathtaking series of what I can only call structure trees. Massive living hemlocks had been aggressively bent and physically woven together when they were just young, pliable saplings. The thick, living trunks formed a sequence of massive, interlocking arches that completely defied standard botanical growth patterns. The sheer physical force required to permanently manipulate trees of this massive scale was absolutely staggering to comprehend. They weren't broken or dying. They were thriving, actively growing into the exact unnatural shapes dictated by their unseen architects. It was a massive, living monument, constructed from the very fabric of the deep forest itself. I pulled a small measuring tape from my jacket, carefully studying the extreme angles of the woven hemlocks. As I calculated the specific degree of the massive arches, a profound, staggering realization completely washed over me. The precise mathematical pitch of these living woven trees perfectly mirrored the heavy roof pitch of my grandfather's cabin. The Sasquatch hadn't just aimlessly bent the timber, they had actively recreated the architectural signature of Thomas's sanctuary. This wasn't a random feral nesting ground built by mindless animals seeking crude shelter from the freezing rain. It was a deliberate, generational tribute to the incredibly heavy, rhythmic alliance forged in the winter of 1952. The structure trees proved that the giant's descendants had intimately studied the cabin's exact, complex architectural geometry. The lineage of the silent partner likely still lingered in these shadows, quietly maintaining this living, wooden echo. It was as if the Sasquatch family had been keeping a silent, unbroken vigil over my grandfather's work. For over 70 years, they had actively monitored the solitary human dwelling from their hidden, perfectly camouflaged outposts. They were ensuring that the physical monument to their shared history remained completely undisturbed in the high timber. The majestic guardians of the Cascades had never actually abandoned the valley when the heavy roof was completed. I stood under the massive woven hemlock arches, feeling incredibly small and entirely humbled by the historical weight. The local legends and campfire myths completely failed to capture the profound architectural brilliance of these hidden beings. They were not primitive monsters blindly roaming the mountains. They were the true unseen landlords of this valley. They possessed an intimate, sovereign claim to the land that far superseded any fragile human paper deed. My grandfather was merely the first approved human tenant, permitted to reside within their massive, heavily guarded borders. I was now inheriting that incredibly rare, unspoken lease, entirely dependent on maintaining their strict, demanding rules of respect. I didn't dare touch the living arches or aggressively disturb the pristine, mossy ground of the circular clearing. I intimately understood that crossing that invisible boundary would be a massive, disrespectful violation of their sovereign territory. The structure trees were a clear, undeniable marker separating the approved human zone from the deeply restricted wild sanctuary. I slowly backed away from the woven hemlocks, ensuring my movements were completely deliberate, calm, and non-threatening. I wanted to clearly telegraph my absolute, unwavering respect to whatever massive intelligence was currently watching from the canopy. The unspoken treaty my grandfather had bravely established in the freezing mud was still actively in effect today. The hike back to the cabin felt completely different, charged with a thrilling, terrifying new reality of coexistence. I looked at the towering, ancient cedars with a completely renewed, profound sense of deep ecological awe. Every snapped branch and disturbed patch of brush now carried the heavy, thrilling potential of a massive footprint. The valley was undeniably shared, completely supervised by a lineage that had effortlessly mastered the art of invisibility. I finally understood why Thomas had aggressively protected this specific parcel of land from developers and loggers. He was actively shielding his massive, silent neighbors from the destructive, chaotic machinery of the modern, greedy world. As the heavy log structure of the cabin finally came back into view, I saw it with entirely new eyes. It wasn't just a testament to my grandfather's stubborn, grueling physical endurance in the face of brutal nature. It was a permanent, diplomatic embassy standing proudly on the heavily guarded border of an ancient unknown kingdom. The intricately notched cedar walls were a physical, enduring bridge between two completely different, highly intelligent hominid species. The giant's fingerprints were still visibly compressed into the high timber, silently broadcasting a message of shared labor. The true history of this rugged mountain sanctuary was vastly more incredible than any fictional campfire ghost story. I climbed the heavy wooden steps of the porch, my mind frantically racing with the implications of my discovery. The structure trees completely validated every single impossible word written in Thomas's hidden leather-bound 1952 diary. But accepting this magnificent, terrifying reality forced me to completely reevaluate my entire, foundational understanding of our family history. If a towering giant had actively intervened to save my grandfather's life, what else had been secretly orchestrated? I needed to sit back down at the heavy wooden table and fiercely examine the unexplained gaps in our past. The buried journal was actively challenging me to look much closer at the terrifying, beautiful legacy we had inherited. Thomas kept this magnificent secret buried deep beneath the dusty floorboards for a very specific, heartbreaking reason. He intimately knew the terrifying vulnerability of the unknown when exposed to the harsh glare of modern humanity. The outside world is completely obsessed with violently capturing, dissecting, and aggressively categorizing anything it doesn't understand. Revealing the gentle, towering giant would have instantly placed a massive, lethal target on the creature's broad back. My grandfather loved the silent partner far too much to ever betray their heavy, rhythmic alliance to science. The heavy leather journal was an absolute confession meant only for eyes that truly respected the high timber. Finding this incredible diary has profoundly challenged me to look much closer at my own family's history. It actively forces me to fiercely examine the completely unexplained gaps and miraculous survival stories of our ancestors. How many of those rugged pioneer men and women survived the impossible only because of a hidden hand? We arrogantly attribute our generational survival to sheer human grit, completely ignoring the dark shadows of the forest. The arrogant, human-centric narrative completely dismisses the terrifyingly beautiful possibility of an ancient, watchful guardian in the dark. My grandfather's terrifying winter of 1952 proves that we were absolutely not alone in the freezing, brutal wilderness. The imposing cedar cabin stands today as a permanent, wooden monument to a truly impossible shared timeline. It represents a brief, magnificent era when a fragile man and a towering Bigfoot shared a common goal. They completely bypassed the massive evolutionary divide, united by the desperate, freezing need to simply build a shelter. This incredible structure effortlessly proves that the dense wilderness isn't just something to be violently conquered or logged. The deep, unforgiving forest is actually a highly intelligent, watchful neighbor that absolutely demands our utmost silent respect. We are merely temporary, fragile guests walking through an ancient kingdom that was established millions of years ago. I sit at the heavy wooden table my grandfather built, completely surrounded by the physical evidence he left. The polished river stones and the heavy, crystallized, petrified wood are incredibly powerful artifacts of an alien friendship. They actively radiate a deep, silent energy that completely humbles my modern, cynical understanding of the natural world. I realize that the true legacy of this property isn't the valuable timber or the pristine mountain acreage. The absolute defining legacy is the heavy burden of the silence that I have now officially, permanently inherited. I am the newest, sworn protector of the majestic lineage that still quietly watches from the woven hemlocks. My grandfather's final charcoal sketch is currently framed and hanging proudly above the massive stone hearth he built. It serves as a daily, visual reminder of the towering guardian who actively chose mercy over primal violence. Every time the winter wind violently howls against the exterior walls, I think of the freezing, muddy clearing. I vividly imagine the deafening, percussive knocks echoing through the dark, successfully signaling the hoist of a heavy log. The cabin is fundamentally infused with the incredible brute strength and the profound empathic intelligence of the Sasquatch. It is completely impossible to sleep within these walls without feeling a deep, spiritual connection to the giant. The scientific community would aggressively laugh at the impossible claims hidden within these aged, yellowing diary pages. They would completely dismiss the 11-foot compression marks as natural, biological anomalies or elaborate generational family hoaxes. Their rigid, arrogant textbooks have absolutely no room for an incredibly advanced, 8-foot-tall hominid building a human house. But their sterile, comfortable laboratories are miles away from the terrifying, beautiful reality of the high Cascade ridges. They haven't walked the perimeter of the property or stood completely humbled beneath the massive, woven structure trees. They are aggressively blind to the absolute truth because they completely refuse to respectfully look into the shadows. I have made a firm, completely unbreakable decision regarding the future of my grandfather's hidden leather-bound journal. I will never surrender this incredible, historical document to a university archive or a hungry, ambitious media outlet. The diary will safely remain exactly where Thomas originally intended, deeply hidden from the destructive, greedy modern world. It is a sacred family relic that completely belongs to the quiet, isolated sanctuary of the high timber. I will actively continue the generational cover-up, aggressively defending the absolute sovereignty of the hidden mountain valley. The majestic silver-haired lineage successfully earned their complete privacy with every single back-breaking log they effortlessly hoisted. This profound, terrifying knowledge has completely altered the way I interact with the dense, surrounding ancient forest. I no longer hike through the deep brush with the loud, arrogant, heavy footsteps of a modern conqueror. I walk softly, constantly maintaining a high level of situational awareness, actively looking for signs of the watchers. I intentionally leave small, high-protein offerings on the exact same flat stump my grandfather used in 1952. I do not expect a massive shadowed giant to step into the clearing and physically take the meat. It is simply a quiet, respectful gesture of continued goodwill toward the ancient landlords of the surrounding mountains. The offerings frequently completely vanish by the time the freezing mountain sun breaks over the jagged limestone ridges. I never search the surrounding mud for massive, splayed footprints or set up invasive hidden trail cameras nearby. The absolute beauty of the rhythmic alliance is completely rooted in the profound, unwavering respect for their invisibility. Attempting to forcefully document the magnificent creatures would instantly violate the unspoken, sacred treaty forged in the dark. My grandfather promised them absolute silence, and I am fiercely determined to honor that heavy interspecies contract today. The mystery is vastly more important than the arrogant human desire to aggressively dissect and categorize the unknown. As the deep, purple twilight aggressively descends upon the isolated valley, I slowly step out onto the porch. The crisp, biting mountain air fills my lungs, carrying the sharp, familiar scent of ancient cedar and pine. I look toward the dense, unbroken tree line, perfectly remembering the massive, shadowed silhouette from the charcoal sketch inside. I know with absolute, terrifying certainty that the deep woods are not empty despite what the textbooks claim. The descendants of the silent laborer are out there right now, effortlessly navigating the steep, treacherous mountain terrain. They are actively living completely parallel to our destructive civilization, perfectly adapted to the unforgiving, freezing high altitude. A sudden, heavy snap of a massive branch violently breaks the total silence of the dark, nocturnal forest. It isn't the chaotic, clumsy sound of a fleeing deer or the heavy, lumbering gait of a desperate bear. The sharp noise is incredibly deliberate, originating from the exact location of the woven, ancient hemlock structure trees. I stand completely still on the wooden porch, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my chest, exactly like Thomas. A massive, overwhelming wave of static electricity suddenly floods the small clearing, making the hair on my arms rise. The atmosphere instantly shifts, becoming incredibly heavy with the undeniable empathic presence of an ancient, towering intelligence. I do not reach for a heavy hunting rifle or desperately retreat inside the safety of the log walls. I simply raise my hand in the freezing dark, offering a silent, respectful acknowledgement to the dense shadows. A single deafening, percussive knock violently echoes from the tree line, physically shaking the wooden floorboards beneath my boots. It is the exact same rhythmic signal the giant used to aggressively hoist the heavy timber in 1952. The ancient alliance is still incredibly, vibrantly alive, successfully spanning across 3 generations of humans and massive guardians. As I listen to the heavy, fading footsteps in the snow, I wonder what other secrets the diary holds.